If your vocals aren't processed properly, it will be something that listeners will notice instantly. So it's important that you pay extra attention to the vocals when you're mixing. The very first step to incredible sounding vocals is the EQ. So it's really important that you get the EQ right. In today's mixing tutorial, I'm going to share my EQ approach when working with vocals. We're specifically going to look into two plugins in Logic, and it's the channel EQ and the vintage tube EQ. These are kind of the main EQs that I used when mixing vocals. So let's dive into Logic. So as I mentioned, there are two EQs in Logic that I mainly use when mixing vocals. So let's try to add these on a vocal track that I have. The channel EQ right here and the vintage tube EQ. You can find the vintage tube EQ by going to EQ and vintage EQ collection and then vintage tube EQ. So there you go. So the channel EQ can give some great visual guidance when you're mixing, whereas the vintage tube EQ can create some interesting saturation and color to your track. So let's address the pros and cons of these EQs. The pros of the channel EQ is that it targets specific frequencies. So in most cases, you will have to target specific frequencies that occasionally pops out and sounds unpleasant to the ears. With the channel EQ, you can create a narrow band and sweep around the frequency spectrum to kind of locate these. So it's especially good for EQ reduction and for searching frequencies that you want to cut. Enables decision making based on what you're seeing and hearing. So you can create a narrow band and sweep around the frequency spectrum to locate these nasty frequencies. Although this should be mainly based on what you hear, the visuals will sort of teach your ears what problematic frequencies you should focus on. So eventually, when you're working with a brand new project and you start with, let's say, the vocals, you will most likely be able to hear problematic frequencies since you worked a lot with the channel EQ. So it's good for sonic practice and for the overall understanding of sonics, I would say. The cons of the channel EQ is that it has limited tonal shaping. So although you can boost frequencies in the channel EQ and create a sweet tone, it still has some limitations. By drastically boosting a specific area for tonal shaping, it will often result in a harsh character. There's no multiband compressor or compressor interacted in this plugin, but sometimes you can get a great tone by doing subtle boosts. Inhibits decisions based on what you're hearing. So as an aspiring mixing engineer, you will most likely learn a lot of EQ rules and guidelines. When mixing a piano, boost at 500. When mixing vocals, boost at 2K and put a high-pass filter up to 150 Hz and so forth. By relying mainly on the frequency content that you see, you could as a beginner make decisions based on these rules and guidelines without letting your ears be a part of the EQ decision. So you might hesitate to boost or reduce frequencies that sounds right to your ears. The pros of the vintage tube EQ is that it has EQ with saturation. So you can not only boost specific frequencies but also adjust the drive, where you also have different settings in the output model. So check that out. So this is great for tonal shaping, where you can create some excitement and a more grittier character to your instrument. Your ears are making the decisions. So as we established, making decisions based on what you see can be problematic. In the tube EQ, however, you are not equally distracted by the frequency content, even if there's some brief info in there. So these knobs are very simple, you're making basic tweaking and there's not much visual info going on, which results in your ears being the primary focus, thus being the main decision maker. The cons of the vintage tube EQ is that it has difficulties locating specific problematic frequencies. So although you can make relatively targeted cuts, it can sometimes be difficult to spot these if you have untrained ears. The channel EQ, however, gives you some great visual guidance of what actually goes on. and it shows exactly what you're doing. So let's add some EQing on this vocal track and kind of based on the pros and cons of these EQs. So let's take a listen to this vocal track and what it sounds like without any EQing.
She will be the one to know you. I will be the one to hold you, hold you, hold you. She will be the one to know you. I will be the one to hold you, hold you, hold you.
So based on what we're hearing and seeing, I would say that it has some unnecessary bass buildup. So I'm gonna put a high pass filter just to get rid of the some unnecessary bass buildup. We're gonna put it at around 100. Right, so we're also gonna put a high shelf on this because I can see and hear that there's some lack of high-end content. We wanna put a high shelf right there just to kind of give it some more air and add some presence to the vocals. I can also hear some unnecessary build-up in the lower mids. Specifically at around 300 hertz, we can see that there's a lot of frequencies going on at around 300 hertz. We're gonna locate this frequency that I hear.
She will be the one to know you. I will be the one to hold you, hold you, hold you.
Right there at 300 hertz, you can hear that it gives some unpleasant sounds.
She will be the one to know you. I will be the one to hold you, hold you, hold you.
So let's get rid of that because there's too much buildup at 300 hertz. We have a narrow band here, so we're gonna do some reduction just to get rid of the worst kind of buildup right there. So at around 300. Right, so based on the foundation that we created with the channel EQ, let's try to add some character with the help of the vintage tube EQ. So we're gonna put the high bandwidth at like in the middle. That would be a good starter point. And just kind of sweep around right here at the high frequency, that knob, and kind of sweep around as we listen, and let's create a good tone, right?
She will be the one to know you. I will be the one to hold you, hold you, hold you. She will be the one to know you. I will be the one to hold you, hold you, hold you.
So at 6K, it sounds pretty good.
She will be the one to know you. I will be the one to hold you, hold you, hold you. She will be the one to know you. I will be the one to hold you, hold you, hold you.
So by adding the vintage tube EQ, we've created some more saturation and added a bit more character, and just it sounds thicker, right? So yeah, there you go. Some basic EQing that you can do with Logic's EQs. And let's take a listen to this without the EQs, before and
She
after.
will be the one to know you. I will be the one
With the channel
to
EQ,
hold you, hold you. She will be
vintage tube EQ.
Hold you, hold you, hold you.
So there you go. Some tips and tricks on how to EQ your vocals. I'd really suggest experimenting with a vintage tube EQ and kind of sweep around just to get to know the vintage tube EQ. And you could also experiment with different EQs. There's a great selection of EQs in Logic. So don't settle for just one EQ. So don't just settle with the channel EQ for tonal shaping and so forth. Just combine different EQs. Thanks for watching the video, guys. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming mixing tutorials. Until then, keep creating, keep mixing, and I'll see you in the next video.